We are now live.
Okay, we're live. Senate Appropriations, Tuesday, January 21st. We're going to have first discussion about ARPA funds, both from GFO and then from the Recovery Office. So Emily's going to give us a little primer on ARPA funds. Yes. Not on ARPA in total.
Yes, that's since we have a new committee, not everybody, I think most folks were around, but not necessarily in the Appropriations Committee when the ARPA funds were allocated, and I should, before that, for the record, Emily Burns from the Joint Fiscal Office. So, here we go. All right, so ARPA is the American Rescue Plan Act. So it was passed, but also I'll refer to it as ARPA probably throughout. But so it was an economic stimulus bill passed in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I should, before I jump really into the weeds, I'm just going to do a very high-level overview of what it is, where the state ARPA dollars went, what was an allowable use, some of the sort of definitions and terms, and then Douglas Farnham will go into a lot like more details in terms of the status of funds today. So I should be pretty quick. But so we had the ARPA was an economic stimulus bill passed after COVID-19. It allocated $350 billion to state and local governments. And it's often referred to as the state and local fiscal recovery funds. And of that $350 billion, Vermont received about $1 billion. It was a significant amount of money for the states to receive, but it was fairly restricted in terms of allowable uses of the dollars. It was expanded. There were some treasury rules that expanded the allowable uses, but the big uses were sort of to replace lost public sector revenue. So pandemic happened, some tax receipts didn't come in, sort of allow states to backfill those lost revenue dollars, to help with the public health emergency and the negative economic impacts of the pandemic itself, provide pay for the essential workers that had to keep working as a result of the pandemic, and to make investments in water, sewer, broadband infrastructure. Those sort of first four were the main places that Vermont appropriated all of its state and local recovery funds. The last three, emergency relief for natural disasters, support for surface transportation projects, and to support the Title I block grants, those eligibility categories sort of came in later. So most of the uses that Vermont spent money under in terms of eligible projects were sort of in those first four. Most of those funds, so the General Assembly appropriated all of those funds through the FY22 budget and the FY23 budget. So these are sort of all of the acts that were passed that had some allocations of the ARPA funds, but $1 billion was appropriated to agencies and departments to spend between Act 74 of 2021 and Act 185 in FY23, and these links should take you to those acts should you want to dig into them. A lot of those appropriations are at the very end of those budget bills in the G section. I think when Grady was in and he was talking about sort of how the budget is structured, this was one of those that sort of got tacked on to the end to kind of keep it out of this sort of normal budget, if you will. This is a chart that my predecessor put together, but this is just a high-level overview of where all of those funds went. So the economy and workforce, housing, broadband and IT, climate action, clean water projects, and then some administrative needs. Because it was an awful lot of money to have to try to spend. Right, the state budget is $8 to $10 billion annually, and this is an extra billion. So that's a lot of work to do. It's a lot of work to spend a lot of money too.
Sounds like a headache.
Yes. Don't kids speak more sad. But I think one of the most important things around ARPA funds is to have sort of have everybody on the same page in terms of the terminology when it comes to the spending it. So there were specific guidelines not allowing how you could spend the money, but sort of when the money had to be spent. So the ARPA funds had to be obligated by 12/31/2024. And what obligated means in this context that it has to be committed in a grant or a contract, a service has to be purchased, or an order has to be placed. So there has to be some sort of agreement with another entity Obligated doesn't mean appropriated, right? So the General Assembly's role was to appropriate those funds, to give the spending authorities, the agencies and departments, to enter into those agreements, right? So here's $10 million, go execute some grants to do a certain project, and the like. So that obligation period has gone, right? So the General Assembly appropriated all those funds through the 22 and 23 budgets, and then all of those obligations had to be met by the end of last month. So in the next sort of important term is the ARPA funds have to be expended by 12/31/2026. And expended means that the invoices are actually paid, that the grants or contracts for those eligible activities have been completed. And the sort of period of performance is, federal terminology in terms of like when the activity has to take place. So it has to take place between 12/31/2021, which is when the ARPA Act was authorized, and then through 12/31/2026. So, as I said, sort of all the ARPA funds awarded to Vermont, that $1 billion, they've been appropriated by the General Assembly, and that obligation period is complete. So Douglas will speak more to the obligation period and what has happened, but not all of those funds have been expended. So not all of the activity has been complete. There's another 23 months to sort of finish the work in expending those ARPA funds. And just, it's important to note, U.S. Treasury was required to recapture all the ARPA funds that were not obligated by 12/31/2024, but we have obligated everything and there's no risk of recapture. I think there is a sort of another recapture period at the end of calendar 2026, when if things aren't expended, then money will have to go back to Treasury, but we will all try to avoid that if we can. And I know there's been some conversations about sort of this reversion process and what happened at the end of 2024. So in the fiscal 25 budget, there was language that allowed the administration to revert any appropriations that looked like they wouldn't be obligated, or that likely wouldn't be spent by the end of FY26, to try to make sure that none of the money would get sent back to the federal government. As part of that, there was direction in the budget that said any of the funds that were identified to either not be obligated or not be spent would be reallocated in the following order. So the first one was for $36 million for FEMA match to support hazard mitigation, and the match for the sort of state buildings that needed to be repaired after the Montpelier flood and other areas where FEMA match was needed. $4 million for there's going to be administrative and audit needs likely on this fund. The next $30 million was to go to BHCB, and then $25 million to the HFA. After the administration went through the process as authorized by the General Assembly in terms of looking at the ARPA appropriations, what would be obligated or not, they have identified about $26.4 million of funds that were available, and those were reverted and went to that first line of the contingent appropriations for the ARPA funds for FEMA matching to support hazard mitigation. And it's in report number, right, everything was appropriated, so everybody was out working on those projects, and it was really pulling back just like what looked like was sort of in jeopardy in terms of clawback. I believe that's all that no, there's one more thing. Douglas will probably speak to this idea of curing, or you've heard about this in terms of curing is really sort of converting ARPA funds to general funds. So the federal government allowed states to utilize the ARPA funds for certain base government programs that had to keep happening during the pandemic. One that we saw a lot sort of in this committee was corrections payroll, for example, or the health department payroll, whereby stuff that was used, general fund was used to cover those costs. You could, during a specific time period, you could use ARPA funds instead, thereby sort of making that general fund available for other things. So in the budget of last year, in the 25 budget, it's in the sort of second sub-bullet, General Assembly allowed the administration to sort of revert and reestablish appropriations across governmental units in a net neutral manner, so it didn't really create any additional spending authority, but in areas where there looked like there maybe needed to be a little bit more flexibility on timelines. The example I like to use is the area of water and wastewater projects. A lot of it, resources got diverted over the last 2 years because of the floods from, needing to work on ARPA projects. And so there was this curing or switching of federal funds for general funds in some of these projects in order to give them a little bit more time to complete those projects, and to sort of buy time into the next construction season, and not to sort of arbitrarily cut them off for the federal legislation. So then there's just a little sort of chart, just an example of this, and this happened in a couple other, this sort of curing happened across different entities in state government, right? You take the general funds in the DOC, you turn it into ARPA funds, and you take that you release the ARPA funds from the wastewater projects, you just switch them. And it's really an accounting entry. It doesn't change base appropriations for anybody. It's really just those funds that were general funds are now federal funds, and these federal funds are now general funds, basically. That was my last slide.
Is that what the administration did with the last minute higher ed funds in December?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that's a good question for Douglas, but that was an allowable place to utilize federal funds within the higher ed area.
And they swapped out they took the general fund for most of higher ed.
That's the sort of high level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Good. Right? And we'll move on to Mr. Farnham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. You want to tell us who you are?
Absolutely. So Douglas Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer for the state of Vermont, overseeing administration of, the still remaining administration of coronavirus relief funds, emergency relief assistance funds, state, local fiscal recovery funds, as well as the flood recovery efforts with FEMA, USDA Rural Development, and other agencies. So mostly focused on interactions with the federal government related to disasters.
And unfortunately, we keep having them.
Yes. More in the last 2 years than in any other period in our history.
So we heard the overview from Emily, kind of what we had done in the past with this money. Is there anything that you want us to report on as far as what kind of happened with the money that was reverted, or?
Yeah, I can walk through, Mr. Chair. I belatedly shared a spreadsheet that shows all of the ARPA programs. So I acknowledge that this was shared very recently, just within the last 20 minutes. It was used for my House testimony, and I apologize if all got dropped on sharing that with all of you. But if you have time to look at that spreadsheet, it's a good place to get, it's a dashboard of ARPA programs. So it has every ARPA program, whether or not we took any action in December related to it, so that it would add up to the 1.049 billion. And what I can do is kind of go from left to right and talk about the structure of that spreadsheet, because that's the lay of the land, and that would be, I think, helpful for anyone that wants to ask follow-up questions about particular actions that happened or actions that might have to happen.
So this is all the funding, whether it was reverted or not?
Yes. So starting from left to right, we have the legal citations for what act created the program. Most programs, of course, were created in 2021 and 2022, and then with minor modifications, cleanup, technical adjustments in 2023 and even 2024. The category is the next column, the third column from the left. That we have treasury categories, we have the administration's categories, and then we have the legislature's categories. So they're mostly the same, but the category is always problematic because I don't know if these always line up. We might have tried to use the legislative categories here, but I am not certain. I know we didn't use treasuries because Treasury does not have a climate change category, and I believe climate action. Yeah, we have a climate action category, and Treasury does not have one of those for the ARPA programs. Then we have, of course, the agency, and then the DEPT ID is the place in our financial accounting system Vision where the money can be found, the spending authority can be found. That's mostly for joint fiscal office, but one note I would make here is that even when we have cured some of the funds so that part or all of that spending authority is general fund, we have not changed this number. So these numbers are intended to go back to the beginning of the establishment of the program. If you want to see the history, it's all under that one DECT ID. The name of the appropriation, and this is important because we do our best here. It doesn't always explain fully what it is. In some cases, the appropriation has multiple programs underneath it. And Public Service Department in particular had one appropriation, 5 or 6 programs being run underneath that money. We've tried to crosswalk it different ways, but because we track the money at the appropriation level, this is the lesser of the evils as far as tracking and not having all the details. So if you have questions about programs underneath an appropriation, you can connect with me or you can connect with the department that's administering that appropriation to get more details on the specific programs. Then we have the original SFR appropriation. So next column, that's the 1.049 billion. We are over appropriated by about 42,000.
Sorry, SFR.
Yeah.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, good to ask those questions.
So the federal name is State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. We have abbreviated it internally to State Fiscal Recovery Funds because local fiscal recovery funds went directly to the towns, and we don't have any ongoing role in the administration of those funds. So those monies, we don't get reports from the towns, we don't oversee them in any way. I get a lot of press questions about what town's doing with their money, and we honestly have no real insight into how they are spending their money. We coordinate at a very high level with the League of Cities and Towns on just offering guidance and direction to the towns, but that is purely between US Treasury and the towns. We acted as a payment processor just to get them the money for Treasury, and then after that, we had no ongoing responsibilities. So then SFR revenue loss, so State Fiscal Recovery revenue loss. Revenue loss is an expenditure category in the federal rule. Just like, COVID-19 mitigation measures, there are 6 or 7 major expenditure categories. Clean water is an expenditure category. Broadband is an expenditure category. Revenue loss is replacement of public sector revenue. So we performed a calculation based on the Treasury rule that gave us 242 million of revenue loss eligibility. This guidance for revenue loss came out after all of the programs were created by the Vermont legislature. So what we did was, we being the administration in this case, we applied that revenue loss eligibility category to programs that were created, especially the ones that had trouble being created under the other eligibility categories of the federal rule. Climate action is my example there, because even though Biden came out, and the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, had a lot of pro-climate programs in it, there was nothing in the Treasury rule about climate action justifying a program. So a weatherization program, for example, at Department of Children and Families, had to be justified by the income levels of the recipients of those funds, not because they were being used for weatherization. But programs stood up at the Public Service Department because they were for moderate income and what we considered low income, but Treasury didn't consider low income because they created their own income standards. And I know I'm throwing a lot out there, I apologize for that. That was ineligible under the other categories of the federal rule, so we had to use the revenue loss eligibility category. The reason I call out only this eligibility category and don't, call out all the other ones is that revenue loss eligibility means there are only 3 prohibited uses, and I always say 3, and then I can only remember 2 of them. You can't invest in pensions, you can't pay off debt service, and then you can't use it as match for Medicaid. I think there might be one more snuck in there.
But that's why we swap penny.
Yes, and then they do not initiate a federal relationship. They do not create sub-recipient arrangements. So they're treated as state money once we've decided on how to spend them, and as long as we don't spend them on those three prohibited uses.
Isn't that category the place that we produce the money to send money into higher ed, and particularly the state colleges?
Yes, so we initially categorized these programs that were having trouble functioning under the final rule as revenue loss. And then in looking at where we were in November and December, most of those programs, because they were more complicated and because it took them longer to start up because they initially couldn't operate under the final rule, they were set back in their schedule. And we looked at how they would be able to spend money between now and the end of the expenditure period. We determined it would be extremely high risk to leave that money in place, even though it was revenue loss. So we used that revenue loss designation to pay the higher education payments for over the course of several fiscal years. And that allowed us to formally have the money expended to US Treasury on a, we'll be able to report all 170 million, I believe, as expended to US Treasury on the report we're compiling right now. It's an eligible use. It doesn't trigger any additional requirements for the higher education institutions. UVM we have to allocate because they do a Medicaid payment with part of their money, so we had to allocate away from that portion and leave them with some general fund each fiscal year. But the decision to be more aggressive with the swapping for that revenue loss money was also, I just have to be very careful with how I state this. With the change of administration, there was just an executive order pausing the disbursement of inflation and infrastructure, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act monies have been fully paused at this point. They're not allowed to disperse that any further. I haven't located an executive order related to ARPA at this point. I don't think there's been one issued, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was one issued related to that. So getting that money as fully expended as possible was done in order to protect Vermont.
Was there any state that didn't meet the deadline that's reverting any funds that you know?
Mr. Chair, we're compiling the report right now. It's due on the 31st of January. So I think Treasury usually publishes the reports that have been filed with them 2 to 4 weeks after they've been filed. So by the end of February, we'll know if any other states return funds from the obligation deadline.
And when we do the curing, the money still has to be spent. So like an example that Emily gave of the change for wastewater to DOC, you still got to spend that same dollar amount on wastewater. You can't just kind of like move it over to DOC and supplant their DOC expenditures.
Absolutely. In E106A, it was net neutral. Agency of Administration only had the ability to take $5 million and either put it into the reversion waterfall that was established or give it back exactly as it was for the exact program that the legislature created. One unintended consequence, because nothing happens without unintended consequences, ARPA was actually waived from environmental and historical preservation review because it was a pandemic emergency program, and general funds are not waived from that. So there are actually a number of programs that we cured that now are looking at having to go back and do historical preservation reviews when they didn't have to before. So we're trying to problem solve that unintended consequence.
Yeah.
But between that and the risk of federal recapture, I would rather they address the historical preservation issue.
Yeah.
I stopped myself from using an acronym there. So the next column over is reverted funds. So you can see we only reverted from about a dozen programs out of over 80. A dozen appropriations out of over 80. So the reversions came from a small number of places. Most of them were programs that were complete, had run their course, hadn't reverted. There were some very challenging ones, and they were kind of concentrated in the climate action sector. And in that case, we ended up negotiating with Efficiency Vermont and the Public Service Department what was a reasonable reversion to land on to balance the risk and the likelihood that they would complete their program by 12/31/2026. So not an easy conversation to have. Those are extremely high priorities. The federal funds have also just, the spigot's been turned off for those climate action programs in the Inflation Reduction Act. So, and that's where we came up with the 26.4 million of reversions. The next column, cured to general fund. This, if you go through the whole sheet, adds up to 234 million, 234.9. So when we say cured to general fund, that means that that's money that will now be reported as fully expended in the report we're compiling right now. And we're going through with every department and agency that filed a report and cross-checking. Just this morning, we identified, unfortunately, 200,000 that building and general services had thought that they had obligated, but wasn't actually obligated. We have a backup plan. That money will not go back to Treasury. It will be obligated. But we will be producing hopefully a very short list of kind of errors that we corrected for in the Treasury report, and we'll need to get those approved by the Joint Fiscal Committee. Because the administration's ability to revert and reestablish without oversight was only through 12/31/2024 because of the deadline. Right. Anything happening after January 1st, we will make the adjustments, report them to Treasury, and then we will ask the Joint Fiscal Committee to approve those transfers between existing ARPA programs. So for the example of the BGS, we were able to find a way for them to retain 50,000 of the 200K. The other 150,000 will be reverted, and the proposal will be for those to go towards, I think we'll probably propose to stay in the construct of the waterfall that was created. Okay. And just continue
hazardous mitigation.
And yes, so I believe we'll propose for those to go towards hazard mitigation. Hopefully that's the only error we uncover, but that's why we're auditing everyone's filings very, very thoroughly this quarter.
So in the swap out that we've all created and that we did in December, every dollar now is obligated and spent, or is there some general fund dollars on the bottom line that will be carried over?
So every dollar is federally expended.
Yeah.
So 234 million is federally expended. Of that 234, 26.4 million went to create the hazard mitigation appropriation. Mm-hmm. So that hazard mitigation appropriation is general fund. The other 208 million went back to the original programs, and it is general fund that should be expended by 12/31/2026. And I know the Joint Fiscal Committee is keeping an eye on that and might make recommendations about how the legislature can maintain
it has to meet that same deadline.
So in most cases,
that dollar amount has to meet that deadline.
It does not. There are some programs that were written, Mr. Chair, with a 12/31/2026 deadline, because they were written that way because of the federal deadline, and right. But not all programs were written with the deadline in Vermont law. So if it has it in Vermont law, yes, there's a deadline. If not, but that deadline would be for the legislature to decide what to do with the money.
There's no penalty by going to pass that, like there would be if it was still ARPA money.
Absolutely. Correct.
You're getting that. I just wanted to know, is that general fund, we have the ability, it could be reappropriated though?
Absolutely. I think the legislature could always have reappropriated ARPA funds up until now without consequence, other than the administration asking for that not to be done because of all the work we've done building the programs and everything. But yes, absolutely. The general fund can be reappropriated.
There's total flexibility.
Absolutely. Yes, no restrictions on reappropriation of those funds.
And then in that contingency fund of the ARPA funds, we had the 36 million of hazardous mitigation. Even we thought there probably would need more money, but that was what we were decided to do. But what about that 4 million that you needed for admin and a single audit? Are you finding that somewhere else? Because that seems like something you would need to spend money on regardless.
Mr. Chair, I can't go into details quite yet.
Gotta wait for the budget address?
Yes,
Okay.
there should be something in there that will be able to address that.
And there's something else well, you can go through the columns.
The next two columns, well, the next column is, so cured to general fund and net SFR, so net state fiscal recovery appropriation remaining. Those are intended to help you sum up, when we can, so if you go to the second line, 10.58 million for the priority capital projects program at Department of Economic Development. 5.71 million of that was converted to general fund, and 4.87 million is remaining as ARPA funds. So one thing we did with the curing was we talked with all of the different programs, looked at their pace, looked at their project completion rate, and we didn't just cure or not cure a program. We tried to take it and spread it around because we couldn't cure everything.
Okay.
So we tried to make it so that we'll have roughly 170 million of ARPA remaining after we file our report at the end of this month. And we have 2 years to spend that 170 million. So we wanted that spending to be distributed as broadly as possible so that we hopefully have all of that expended by the end of this calendar year. And then we have 2026 to make sure everything closes out properly and everything, nothing gets returned.
Right. Sarah Watson.
So on that line, the 4.87 million of the net, that is, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this. So that is money that you anticipate that is obligated, but maybe has been obligated after this 9/30/24, which is the next column. So I'm assuming that because that's less than the 8.3. Does that make sense? I'm trying to make sure that I understand what that, because we're that's not just floating out there in space. It is obligated, and perhaps was obligated after September 30th.
Yes, so on September 30th, that program reported 8.3 million of federal obligations.
Mhm.
So we've reduced their federal cash down to 4.87 million, meaning they have more than enough obligations to cover the remaining federal expenditure. And we believe those projects that they'll be able to spend that 4.87 million well in advance of the 12/31/2026 deadline.
Is that because the 8.3 is, so are they sort of over obligated?
So the remainder, 5.7 million,
Mhm.
which 3.5 is part of that, will be converted to
Okay.
state grants.
Oh,
And
okay.
this was a revenue loss program, so the agreement with
Okay.
the recipient of state funds never was a federal agreement anyway,
Mhm.
so they won't need to amend their agreement. If we took regular ARPA funds, and we did this in some cases, regular ARPA funds with a federal sub-recipient agreement, we converted them to state funds, they would need to convert that agreement to a state agreement and remove the federal terms and conditions.
Thank you.
Yes, so those obligated and expended columns as of September 30th, those are primarily informational and they're the most recent data we have, but they're already quite stale. And in some cases, they're there because, for some of the programs where we had larger reversions, they had almost nothing expended as of September 30th. And that was a major driver in trying to arrive at a reversion amount was, hadn't spent none of the money yet, so we needed to figure out what a reasonable amount to revert was. So that is the current version of the tracking spreadsheet. We're a week or so away from having the federal report buttoned up so that we can make sure we submit something complete to Treasury by January 31st. And then I'll need a little bit of time, but I'll be able to put together presentation materials that show exactly where we are through the end of the calendar year in early February, if the committee wants to see that.
Quick question, on pages 6 and 7, there's no citation for, there's a higher ed, there's a hazard mitigation. Is there a reason for no citation? Is it money that's flexible and can be used in different ways?
That is partly an oversight on our part. The citation for that establishment should have been Act 113, Section E 106.
Got it, okay. Is that up for true for all of them? It's a budget?
Yes, these 3 lines at the bottom of page 6 and then the top 2 lines on page 7. This is where the curing essentially took place. And the hazard mitigation is the only new program, the only new use that the administration established, and that was because it was specifically named by the legislature as something that we could establish. So yes, we should have put 2024 Act 113, Section E 106 as the citation there.
So I apologize, I had to step out, Doug. So what you were just talking about, because I needed someone to explain to me, what is the waterfall for hazard mitigation? If you already talked about that, I assume during my hazard.
So, Senator, the agency administration in last year's budget in Act 113 was given 2 paths. Either do net neutral transfers to convert a program that was created with ARPA, create all or a portion of that as general fund, or if we reverted money, it had to go into a specific list of programs. And the first list on the list was hazard mitigation and FEMA match with $36 million. And so we reverted 26.4 million. So we were only able to get to the first item on the list. The next item was an administrative $4 million to help us run our limited service positions through the end of ARPA. The chair asked about that, and that will likely be an element in the budget. The next item was $30 million for VHCB because we have a housing crisis. And I think, we weren't able to get that far essentially. And at this point, we've identified another 150,000 that we'll need to get Joint Fiscal Committee authorization to move between programs from BGS to the hazard mitigation appropriation. But that was an error, and we hope there are no other errors. If we find several other small errors, then we'll compile them and ask the Joint Fiscal Committee for authorization. But the administration will not be moving any more money without legislative approval at this point in time.
I noticed there was a list that Emily went over to these bulletin points of how that waterfall or contingency list.
Did she refer to that as the keyword portion of it, or?
She referred to it as the contingency list.
Contingency.
Okay.
That was in the budget last year.
Yeah, sorry, Senator. It also overlaps because anything going into the waterfall, we cured before putting it in there because devoting it to a new use in the final month of ARPA and then spending it over the next 2 years would be high risk.
Thank you.
We didn't want to do that.
So in the budget adjustment, you don't really have a lot in that document itself.
Right.
There was just it's just some of this curing and then just clarifying the language.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Most of the recovery related issues, because we just got a federal disaster supplemental in December, which we've already identified over 120 million, actually 130 million now, that's coming to Vermont specifically through that disaster supplemental. We didn't want to put too much in the Budget Adjustment Act because of the timing of that disaster supplemental coming out. And we wanted to see how we'd be able to line things up, and then there will be some recovery related proposals in the budget.
All right. Did you have anything else you wanted to tell us about? Does anybody else have any questions for Mr. Farman? Yeah.
I think I just need to be clear about something. So the reverted, what's in the column of reverted funds? That, I apologize. I just need one more time. What is happening to those reverted funds? Are they going back to the Treasury?
No.
No, okay,
Yes.
okay.
Good question.
Yeah,
The reverted funds are 1-for-1 going into the next column, the waterfall for hazard mitigation.
okay, thank you.
So if we had more than 36 million, then they would have gone to additional uses. But we only had 26.4, so they only changed that
Oh, I see.
one use.
So that's why those two
Yes.
lines match. Perfect,
It's-
thank you.
And again, this is overly complex and frustrating, but anything that was cured to general fund was also reverted from the original program. But we didn't put that on the paper because we reverted it and then we gave them back that same exact amount of money. So those programs were not financially harmed or undermined in any way. We preserved the legislative intent of those programs by taking some ARPA, giving them back the same exact amount of general fund. And then, as the discussion pointed out earlier, that's general fund now. The legislature can discuss and make decisions about that general fund without federal considerations at this point.
And then overall, you consider it good news, because I think I remember maybe this time last year, we thought it might be 100 million that you would need to revert, or we would get to revert, depending on how you look at it. But you think that was a positive thing, like the programs that we appropriated the money for, because Doug Farnham was starting to call them and say, hey, we're gonna revert it if you don't use it. A lot more got used than we thought, right?
Yes. After the session, immediately after the session, I did begin being very blunt with programs in the summer that I'm going to be trying to take your money if you don't spend it. So, and even with the established use of the waterfall, where the legislature had said anything that comes back needs to go to these purposes, I think out of session administrative reversions are complicated, right? Because it's like, well, this is the original intent of the program. This is the original legislative intent. So who are you to say it should go to this use instead of that use? So I think we arrived at a good middle ground on the amount we ended up reverting that balances the risk and tries to preserve the original legislative intent that these programs will be funded through 12/31/2026. But I think the legislature can choose to let them run longer or shorter at this point in time without the same considerations as when they were fully federally funded.
That's good to know. Okay, any other ARPA questions? If not, we'll let you go. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chair.
And then we will have the Agency of Human Services come in. You want to both have a seat, Secretary and Richard, if you want to pull up one. Thank you for joining us. I'll let you introduce yourselves for the committee.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jenny Samuelson. I'm the Secretary for the Agency of Services. Here by my colleague.
Apologies.
We're all new, so go ahead, Senator.
Pat Brennan, from Colchester, Grand Isle District.
Jenny Lyons, Chittenden Southeast.
Andrew Perkslick of Washington District.
I'm Rich Westman from Wayne District.
Bob Norris, Franklin County, and the town of Elberg and Grand Isle County.
And Watsonville, Washington District.
So it's Senator Bruce will hopefully be joining us soon.
I'll just share my screen if that works for our PowerPoint.
So, Chair, our goal today is to introduce the broad agency budget. It's my understanding that you've got most of the AHS, if not all of the AHS departments coming in very, very shortly after us. So we will go into the broad swaths if it suits you. We will also then dig into the Agency of Human Services central office budget, which is managed at the central office. Chair, do you have a preference on whether we take questions throughout or whether folks hold their questions until?
Whatever works best for you.
And my preference is that we take questions as folks come up to them at your. Okay, so just as a grounding force, the Agency of Human Services budget as appropriated is $5.4 billion across all funds. That is $1.3 billion in general funds. The proposed BAA is $29.1 million of general funds. As a grounding force for those of you who haven't that worked with the AHS departments as closely as others, the Agency of Human Services is composed of 6 departments. The agency of the Department for Aging and Independent Living, or DALE, the Department for Children and Families, Corrections, the Department for Health, the Department for Vermont Health Access, which many of you will assume is the Medicaid program, though I want to, as you think about, and I know you got an orientation to Medicaid, in the agency, while DEVA administers many of the Medicaid programs, they are also administered across the agency in the Department for Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living, particularly in the Department for Mental Health. So in a broad swath, our budget adjustment, and I'm going to try to limit acronyms, but please call me on them if for some reason there's an acronym that we use that you are not aware of. For the Agency of Human Service, our budget adjustment falls into some clear categories. The first is caseload and utilization adjustments, and Rich is going to go through the detailed numbers of each of these after I give kind of the broader overview. And in caseload and utilization, what we do on an annual basis is we predict the number of people who will enroll on our programs, and then depending on how many people enroll in actuality and the amount of services they use, we typically are in the legislature every year doing budget adjustment. A case and example, for Medicaid consensus forecast, we predict how many individuals will be enrolled in Medicaid on an annual basis. And this year, while enrollment has been relatively steady compared to what we predicted, utilization has been higher than predicted. In addition to caseload and utilization pressures, we also have the annual ACO settlement. Typically, we've been here saying, okay, our utilization has either been above or below, and that's been what our settlement is. But this year, our settlement is actually focused on the number of individuals who were originally estimated to be children in the program, but given re-enrollment, were enrolled in the program as adults. And the cost of an adult is typically paid at a higher PM or per member per month. And so this is an adjustment that reflects more adults enrolled in the program than children.
So where do those payments go? Can you explain that?
Yeah. So the payments on an annual basis to the ACO go to the ACO, and then they are paid out as prospective payments to each one of the hospitals and the providers across the hospital providers across the system. We have moved in Vermont, and this goes to one of the other actual BAA requests. We have moved in Vermont from providing fee-for-service payments to the hospitals for the majority of our Medicaid beneficiaries to prospective per member per month payments to those hospitals. And so again, in this case, the per member per month is higher for an adult than it is for a child. And so as we did re-enrollment, we identified more people who are adults than children. Does that answer your question, Sam?
Yeah, but in our one care no longer exists, right? But that doesn't change the payments, right?
Yeah. That's a great question, and again, it will be a part of our longer conversation.
Okay.
So for the calendar year 24 and for calendar year 25, the ACO will continue to administer the prospective payments on behalf of Medicaid. Going forward, the ACO will no longer exist because beyond payments, they had a broader swath of responsibilities. And instead, we will continue to make prospective payments, and we're currently working on who it will be who will administer those prospective payments.
So the ACO is kind of like winding down. It wasn't like just dissipated.
Nope. The ACO is winding down, and the ACO will be winding down over calendar year 25. So over this calendar year. Okay.
Thank you.
So in addition, you see adjustments for the Agency of Digital Services. Again, we make predictions on an annual basis of how much it will cost for agency-wide digital services, and this is our service level agreement. We have a request following the completion of work by the Green Mountain Care Board to increase the amount of money that is going towards transformation. So that's funding to support the hospitals in making the changes in order to achieve both affordability and sustainability for the hospitals going forward. And so these are actual, they're not payments to hospitals, but consultants that will support them in making service line changes. We have received requests for extraordinary financial relief from nursing homes over this period. You will note that this has been an ongoing conversation with the Appropriations Committee over the last couple of years, where we've made methodology updates following the pandemic to the way that we reimburse nursing homes, because many of our nursing homes have been going concerns. So in other words, close to closing down. And so these are payments that help make up over that period where we hadn't made those adjustments to help support the nursing homes and continuing to stay open.
Do you remember what we did last year for EFRs? Was it a similar dollar amount? Is like it getting worse?
It was a similar dollar amount.
Well, we put 18 in
In the budget.
in the budget, and we readjusted the rates.
And those went into effect for this fiscal year. And
This fiscal year, and then we did a package in the budget adjustment last year above and beyond.
Exactly. So we believe that those adjustments should begin to see that this number go down over time. This is catching up for many of the organizations who experienced strain during the pandemic. And for the skilled nursing facilities, not only did they have the workforce issues, and we're seeing for many of our organizations, their nursing workforce catch up. For our skilled nursing facilities, they use a higher percentage of LNAs and licensed nursing assistants and licensed practical nurses, and we still are seeing significant use of traveling nurses in those workforces, while we're seeing a catch up in registered nurses. So this is taking and providing financial relief for that period of time that we're catching up from. Does that make sense, Senator?
It makes sense. Are we going to get a list?
We can.
Does this list add up to exactly the amount of money, or are you in anticipation that we might have somebody else come in before the end of the
combination of both?
Yes.
It's a combination of those who we have already received requests for extraordinary financial relief, and then based on our estimates of what we're seeing on the ground, enough money to cover for the rest of the year. But Rich, you were going to add.
That's absolutely correct, and also pending EFR requests that have not yet been processed by the Division of Rate Setting. I don't have the exact breakdown between pending versus paid, but the total of what's been paid and what has been pending as requested is approximately $15 million as of now, with anticipation of potential further requests. So we're asking for a buffer. We spent the full appropriation in BAA of 24 for the EFRs that were issued during 24. And we can provide that.
We knew when we finished the budget, when you had 18 million in requests at that time, we knew that there was going to be a budget adjustment on this thing. So at some point, we'll want to see the list.
Yes, we can absolutely get that.
Because nursing homes are not the only place that's in trouble.
And I think that you'll see as we go through budget adjustment where we're trying to address that as well. Because we recognize that, but just for everyone's grounding, for nursing homes and private non-medical institutions, which typically are residential care for children or PNMIs, there is a process for requesting extraordinary financial relief. Since the pandemic, the Agency of Human Services has had an additional, more flexible appropriation that has allowed us to provide extraordinary financial relief for other organizations. And you'll see a request for that in BAA this year based on the instabilities we're seeing in the system.
So other relief for just
I'm gonna spin forward a slide and then we're gonna go back.
Okay,
Um,
good,
for
sorry.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
For AHS, that's why I wanted to ask, it's more dynamic to be able to ask the questions as you do it. For AHS budget adjustments overall, for one-time appropriations, we are requesting to put back in the provider stabilization funding for grants to organizations who are not within PNMIs and EFRs, and skilled nursing facilities, so that we can provide financial relief. Folks have asked what type, just to proceed, that what type of organizations we anticipate here. We know that substance use residential programs, that are federally qualified health centers, and potentially some of our mental health providers are still struggling. And while we are working with them to get to sustainability plans, many of them are working on reorganizing, addressing some of the organizational and structural challenges within their organization, that in order to continue to maintain them in our system of care, we are going to need to provide financial relief to them. And so the agency is requesting this one-time appropriation.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, to spin back to budget adjustment overall, in addition to these general categories, we are requesting funding for Planned Parenthood of Northern New England for healthcare medications, and particularly for inventory management over the next year. So these are the generals. Rich, any other details?
Just a few funding details to dovetail with your themes that you covered. So for Medicaid consensus and utilization, as you're probably aware, we meet with the Joint Fiscal Office, Finance and Management, DEVA, and my team to arrive at a projection for the current fiscal year. So we're asking for $83.5 million gross increase. That requires $35.5 million of general fund because of the state matching dollars necessary for Medicaid. That is partially offset by $15 million gross for the timing of state fiscal year 24 pharmacy rebates that will be received this state fiscal year. There's also the CCFAP consensus caseload utilization. That was also a consensus process with Joint Fiscal Office, DCF, Central Office Fiscal, and Finance and Management. And I think the only other thing I would add to the numbers that you've already covered, Secretary, is the ACO settlement. I believe we landed within 99.9% of planned costs. It was the reattribution across Medicaid eligibility groups that requires that $5.2 million gross appropriation.
You know, the caseload utilization requests and the adjustment, but for those of us that have been doing this for a while, how would you characterize them in relation to historic norms?
Relative to historic norms, there appears to be an increase in the utilization of services generally in general adults and childless new adults. DEVA will be coming in, as you know, to provide testimony. I'm sure they can provide more details for you, but that's the general theme.
And when we say utilization, we mean they're spending more money, like it's getting more expensive per patient.
They're getting,
case.
yeah. So in many of our other insurers, they'll often talk about price and utilization. For Medicaid, price is the same across the board. So what we're actually seeing is an increase in use of healthcare services among Medicaid members.
The actual number of services, not because the cost doesn't change.
That is correct. The cost reflects what we agreed last year for providers in the budget.
Right, but it could also mean they were doing more expensive procedures. Like that's part of utilization.
Correct. And so it's, DEVA can definitely come in and provide you, we have a balance of what that looks like. We have been looking closely at where we are seeing utilization. Again, they can speak to that in more detail. We may well move on then. Yep. So a question earlier had been about how we pay through the ACO, and we talked about the fact that we use prospective payments. We have been working at moving closer and closer to global budgets in the Medicaid program for hospitals. Currently, we have 5 hospitals who are relatively close to doing global budgets with the majority of the individuals they serve in prospective payments.
Can you describe a global thing?
Yeah, a global payment essentially is, best way to think about it is it's a budget. So here is the amount that we predict based on the individuals that you serve. And it's a monthly payment that each of the hospitals receives upfront rather than waiting as in fee for service, where a service is rendered and you're delivered. We predict that upfront, and as Rich said, we were 99% on target for last year. That allows the flexibility and the predictability for hospitals. So it's a budget. So this is the amount of money for your organization based on the individuals that your organization serves.
It's to encourage efficiency and not just better care, primary care. That's something that would save the money over a lot.
Exactly. Our goal in this, in terms of predictability and flexibility, our goal with a global budget is to incent, rather than incenting high revenue services for a hospital, to incent high value services. So if you're making a decision for an individual about whether, for example, to do a hip replacement or to try physical therapy, the goal, as long as it is clinically appropriate for the individual, would be for them to go with the service that provides the more preventive service rather than the intensive service. And in this case, it gives them the more flexibility so that high revenue service is no longer a revenue generator, and the preventive service actually is a lower cost service. And so, as many of you know, we've been working over the last year with our hospitals to decide how to look at services in their area and prioritize the services their communities need. The global budget gives flexibility for them to help transform and to really change the way that they provide services for their communities. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So this funding would allow us, is funded and predictable to do 6 additional hospitals in addition to the 5 we already work with. I think we've covered the provider stability fund. Again, we have providers who are requesting extraordinary financial relief similar to that which we get for skilled nursing facilities. Our goal in every one of those is to work with those organizations on identifying a stability plan, which often means some restructuring, as well as making sure that we address the imminent financial concerns so they can continue to be a provider in our system of care.
And that from my end.
Okay, yeah.
So this is where we start to get into the Secretary's office's budget particulars a bit. And the global commitment appropriation in the Secretary's office, that's where for every one global commitment gross dollar that's budgeted in state government, we need a state matching dollar along with pulling down the federal share of that spending. That combination of appropriations occurs in the Secretary's office global commitment appropriation. So some of the offsets to the increase in caseload and utilization for Medicaid includes increased childless new adult caseload. So that reduces the general fund match pressure by $3.9 million. And then we had carry forward from last state fiscal year of $1.9 million general fund, again, to help offset the state matching dollar pressure required in the budget adjustment. And this is the end of the slide deck presentation, and I can go into the ups and downs details for the Secretary's office appropriations. It's at your discretion, of course.
You have those in the budget adjustment?
Yes.
Yes.
For the departments or
just for the Secretary's office, and then the departments will come in behind us and walk through those ups and downs in terms of your preference.
I guess if you think there's something of value in there, I mean, I can't remember how substantive they were.
For the budget adjustment, they're not particularly substantive, and we've hit on the major points already in the slide deck. So it's whatever your preference is.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there isn't anything that's of substance that we would have questions on, but if it's just kind of the typical personnel changes and things like that, then we know where you work, so we'll find you if we have questions.
Understood.
Is there anything else that you wanted to tell us, or anybody have questions of the secretary? And then, yeah, thank you, and as we go and we see what the house does, we'll be in touch.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
So we didn't have Emily till 2:30. So I assume she's on the way. She's not here. So we basically will take a break till
2:30.
Okay.